paper of record, the establishment paper, if they're saying that he was regarded so highly by the British reporters, why even have one article on him? One article. Now, at least the Irish Times can't ignore Seamus. He's such an activist that he got a level of engagement in the region, in the country, internationally, that could not be ignored. And that's even so. That's only in terms of his public service activities. And you get this. Now, on that vein, if you have the misfortune to own a copy of the so-called Dictionary of Irish Biography, the Dictionary of Irish History, that's a different matter, the Dictionary of Irish History, published in Dublin 1980 by Gillan Macmillan of Ruan O'Donnell. And I'm conscious that there's a camera on me here, so I don't particularly want to get done for slander as well as libel. But anyway, suffice it to say that there's no entry for Seamus Costello. Now, Seamus Costello, whatever one might think about his radical life, and most of us here are deeply interested in that goes without saying, he founded an Irish political party, and he founded an Irish significant revolutionary organisation. There must be, in a dictionary of Irish history, at least a few lines of Seamus Costello. Well, Gillan Macmillan didn't think so in 1980. Well, in 2003, they have the Encyclopedia of Ireland, would you believe, which is a huge tome, right, of in excess of nearly 1,200 pages. No entry for Seamus Costello, right? Now, the IRSP are mentioned once. They're mentioned once in the entry on the IRA, which describes all the IRAs and the offshoots of them up to that point in time. And that's something like a page and a bit. There's no mention, I don't think, of the Irish National Liberation Army whatsoever. Now, that's a massive book. Now, Gillan Macmillan would be a company, and again, I'm conscious of the record here, that would be leaning towards the Fine Gael view of Ireland, which is a legitimate perspective, not one I personally share, I don't believe it, but this is what the establishment is. Amongst those who sponsored the Encyclopedia of Ireland in 2003, it's a very lavish production. I've actually wrote a few entries for it. I'm a bit embarrassed to have any connection with it. Are Diageo, RTE, and the Irish Times. Now, the Irish Times do very well that he should be in that book, but they don't editorial input. Brian Lawler was the man who pulled it all together. So, the other book has entries, for instance, for the 1st, 2nd, and 4th Baron Plunkett. One of Plunkett's Conningham was an prosecutor Robert Emmet. So, the 3 Baron Plunkett and no Seamus Costello. So, I think Gillan Macmillan are telling us something about what we're meant to be and how we're meant to view ourselves. So, if I was to make one outlandish comment, it is this. Irish people, or anyone for that matter, will never be able to write the history of this country by reference solely to the official organs of the state. Particularly in Ireland, where it's such a censorious climate. They will literally write you out of history. Now, I made that point in a different vein, speaking at the Liam Lynch commemoration, not the one attended by that other lunatic, but one down at the IRA memorial in the mountains in Limerick, near where Lynch himself was killed. And I pointed out that the same Encyclopedia of Ireland has no reference to Liam Lynch either, right? And it believes, according to them, the Irish Civil War started in 1927, right? They're confused with I suppose, the retribution that fell on Kevin O'Higgins for his execution of the Republicans. So I'm a little bit dubious. Similarly, I've just finished writing a book on Irish public prison in England in the 1970s, and I harvested a great amount of information from various forms of press organs, and I have a long account from the Times of London about the trial of what became known as Belfast 10, those who carried out the Old Bailey attacks in March 1973, including Jerry Kelly, the Price sisters, Hugh Feeney, some other very prominent Irish Republicans, Roy Walsh, Martin Bray, but basically a very significant IRA unit involved in the first very high-level car bombing attacks in London itself. Now, the article that the Times has a factual error in every sentence, and sometimes 2 in one sentence, right? They had errors of interpretation that are perhaps understandable when you deal with contemporaneous and particularly radical issues. But again, the establishment organs will not permit you to discuss, the basic facts of what happened, let alone what we feel about it. So we are a very, very long way indeed of having any real sense of the history of the revolutionary struggle in Ireland. And it's going to be extremely difficult to do anything about it. Now, events such as this are exactly what we should be doing. And people who, with insight, should be writing about their own experiences insofar as they can, and hopefully eventually will come to a position where through oral history, private archives, collaboration, cooperation over a period of years, we'll have some sort of sense of what happened and why. Because we cannot leave it to the ivory towers. Now, my day job is in university, so I'm theoretically a tenant of an ivory tower, but there's not many people doing the type of history that I feel is essential. and I've been doing it all my life, and I intend to do it for the rest of my life, which hopefully will be quite a few years. I have several more books in gestation. I'd like to get them out at least before I meet my eternal reward, whatever that might be. Now, a few comments on Costello. I'm going to assume that some people here don't know a great deal about his overall career, so I'll go through it very quickly indeed. Mindful indeed that there are people who know more about it than anyone else in the world are also in this same room. Now, the issue of locality came up earlier, and locality is a very interesting concept, because Seamus Costello, as a brain man and a native of this part of the country, always attained and developed a strong power base here through family networks and particularly comradeship. So by the time that he met his tragic and premature and disastrous end in October 1977, he had an exceptionally strong support base in his community. And by virtue of working tirelessly within that community, he had garnered an enormous amount of respect from a wide spectrum of the population of this part of Ireland. That's quite clear. It's quite clear when you look at the tributes to him and those who were involved in commenting on his tragic death. You can see that he had a very major impact in a comparatively short period of time. Now, one thing I find interesting is that in reading some of the speeches that he was giving at historical commemorations at Bodenstown and other political forums like that, you can see that he really was very well read indeed. Now, again, like many of the panel here, I never had the pleasure of meeting Seamus Costello personally, so all my opinions are received, but they are in some cases received on the basis of advice from those who did know him very well. But he does nonetheless speak from his writings and from some of his political statements, as you expect, and indeed it's fortunate that quite a few of them are extant due to the good works of people like Dick Carroll and Sean Doyle and his other comrades and friends. So, we know that he was stimulated nationally when he read about the 1953 Felsted arms raid in England. And ironically, he would later cross paths, at least, with Manus Canning to some degree, but particularly Colin Goulding and Sean MacStefan, who were the other major prisoners on that particular attempt to procure weaponry for the Irish Republican Army. This is what led him, we are told, to commence political engagement at a local level, where everyone should start logically. In other words, selling the United Irishman newspaper, the organ of the public movement of its time. And quite a high quality sheet it was in those days, absolutely. It was markedly better than other forms of political propaganda. And I use that in the best sense of the word. It's essential for politically active people to propagate their message. The reason why you get this instead of that is they feared him. They knew he was very dangerous to what they were, their conception of what Ireland was, what Britain was. So you have to break through that as best you can if you're going to have any form of political impact. At the end of the day, impact is essential, otherwise people are literally wasting their time, although even it's a noble effort. Now, from the fringes of Sinn Féin, he came into the Irish Republican Army at a very young age. And he did so at a time, as I mentioned previously, where it's difficult to actually join the IRA. In many cases, 9 out of 10 people were not accepted. It was quite a careful, long-term build-up that Tony McGann, Paddy McGlogan, Thomas McCurtain were working towards what we now know sometimes as Operation Harvest, or the Border Campaign, or the Resistance Campaign, as they referred to it themselves. And yes, as a teenager, he was initially in the second command, and then later, due to the arrest of Pierce O'Doul, a very close friend to him at that point in time, Pierce O'Doul devolved command of the South Gerry sector to him as a teenager, which is quite extraordinary. Now, my main comment about that is this. For someone who was given that level of responsibility in the IRA of the mid-1950s, late 1950s, it was interesting that he did not feel the temptation to break away in July 56 with Joe Crystal and the very dynamic, active, ideologically driven people who led the Crystal Split in the summer 1956. He didn't do that. And the reason I sent this is, there are those who regard him as being divisive, as does the article in the Times. You'll leave here for people to peruse if they wish, or you can get it yourself off the internet. He was not a divisive man. If anything, he was consistent throughout his life insofar as I can access evidence of his ideology and his political thinking. And I think that's probably fair to say about the interest of talking to anyone who has anything to advise me on in that regard. So he didn't see the necessity of going with the Young Turks, even though he was a Young Turk himself. He stayed with the main force, and he rose within his ranks, and he influenced it from within, which is usually the best way, unless there's an irrevocable breach in terms of tactics of politics, which is a different. He was injured in Derry, in a premature explosion of a grenade. That was a wound that troubled him greatly when he was interned in the Curragh. And his arrest and the time in the Curragh was important. And many of the events that sort of resonate through the late 60s really have their origin in 1957 to 1959 when the Kerr was operational once again on the De Valera. Now, some of those who arrested with him in Glencree in May 1957 were quite a group. There's 38 of them in all. It was a disaster for the Dublin sector IRA, and the vast bulk of the recruits in the Dublin Wicklow sector were rounded up on that occasion. The man in charge of that was the, let's just be kind, eccentric, he's still alive, so be careful, Bernard O'Riordan, of whom I've heard quite a few stories which are shocking indeed. Now, Costello must have encountered O'Riordan, and not simply in the Kerr training, but due to the fact that O'Riordan was the OC in Dunleary, and Bray at different times had come under, or come as an association with that part of County Dublin. Sean Garland, of course, Pontius Rossa, who tells us he jettisoned his links with the Republican movement, certainly the IRA part of it, in 1960. Okay, Pontius. Paddy O'Regan, who was recovering from being injured in the Brookford raid on the 1st of January 1957, including being shot in the back of the neck with a .302 rifle that travelled down the spine and out his back. Peter Pringle, another man with strong local connections at different times, who was arrested on a subsequent occasion. Phil O'Donoghue, names that are resident. On the 6th of May 1959, he was released from the Kerr. Now, at that stage, the IRA, as had been intended, has already begun to fracture, at least in terms of tendencies around Tony McGann, the very efficient, traditional-style chief of staff, and the element around Sean Cronin, which wavered, and particularly Charlie Murphy. The notion of Charlie Murphy, Sean Cronin, versus the old guard of Tony McGann, Paddy McLogan, and Thomas McCurtain. McCurtain very quickly removed himself from the equation. Costello would have heard a lot of internal debate. And even then there were issues such as abstentionism rearing its head as a tanker tactic. Sinn Féin had 5 centrist TDs during the previous campaign, which is quite an achievement, and numerous inroads into county councils. But leaving that aside, by the end of the campaign in February '62, Sinn Féin was in a very bad state of affairs. Wexford was riven with factionalism. All the TDs had been lost, and the head of Sinn Féin, of course, was Paddy McLogan. He was basically ousted instead of Thomas McGill. And Colin Goulding came in instead of Ruan O'Donnell as chief of staff of the IRA. So you have a very significant change going on, which as I said, you reverberate through the 1960s. Now, just to step back for 1 second, the release of Seamus Costello as one of the last batches of people released from the Kerr, by the way, included Noel Kavanagh, who had been a very active governor up in South Fermanagh in the early phases, and knows a very important, politically astute Irish Republican, who was later involved in Wolfe Tone Society, in some of the more progressive aspects of the very interesting and underrated Wolfe Tone Society. Macmillan, the Prime Minister of Britain, happened to be in Belfast on the day of these releases. And he says he described those men as, quote, the hardcore of the illegal organisation. Well, that must have pleased them. I know certainly Noel Kavanagh would have worn that as a badge of honour to describe as the hardcore of the illegal organisation. Now, for Macmillan to be speaking as such at a breakfast or a luncheon for Ulster Unionists is exactly what you could expect from someone like him. And this man is meant to be a progressive. He's meant to be a comparatively moderate figure. Well, suffice to say that campaign did bring home some hard truths, which is that it was possible to have enormous electoral support, but not sufficient active support for the armed campaign on the ground. And that if you did want to wage a guerrilla struggle by means of liberated zones, you must have a higher degree of support on the ground. There weren't enough safe houses, there wasn't enough transport, there weren't enough people providing intelligence for targeting, and there's many reasons for that. They don't concern us. But the point is, they did concern people like Seamus Costello, and this is exactly what they were debating during the campaign, and intensely from 1962, when you have the change of the leadership. It's not a coincidence that Seamus was one of the first Sinn Féin members to return to county councils, of course in his locality stronghold of Bray Urban District Council, and to do so with Joe Doyle. Joe Doyle is another figure who often does get much of a mention, even though he's a very interesting Wicklow man, and I had the pleasure of interviewing his sister about him a number of years ago. From a very political family in those days, later stayed all the way through the Workers' Party, and had Thomas McGill and Goulding give orations and eulogies for him on his death. Doyle has suffered a difficult and debilitating imprisonment, where he's got a life sentence in England. He's one of those sort of forgotten prisoners, and I believe he was the last man emancipated from England in the aftermath of the 50s campaign. So this is the company he was keeping, and it seems to me that wherever he was located within the Republican movement, he was always firmly to the fore of issues to do with the base of abstentionism, tactics in the armed struggle, and indeed tactics of political struggle on the ground, at which he excelled. It's very difficult to think of any other single member of Sinn Féin that made such an actual difference on the ground as Seamus Costello. And I'm not surprised at all that the successors in Irish Public Socialist Party and others looked to him as a prototype, as a template. And this is exactly why he was so feared by the establishment. Because what you're consistently seeing in terms of Costello's life is an attempt to achieve an efficient, impactful balance between radical politics in theory and radical politics in action. And he was someone who would have been looking for a socialist state in Ireland in his lifetime, not to kick the touch next generation. And of course, until the issue of the six counties is definitively resolved, it is going to echo and is going to destabilise the politics and the culture of this entire island, this entire country. Unfortunately, we know this. It always has. There's no reason to presume it will not continue to be so. And there's been enormous political developments in vis-a-vis the issue of local government in the north. But the substantive questions for the time being have been parked. And many people would like to see them being addressed in the near future, of which there is a good chance. Hopefully we'll see what happens. But if you have, as the IRA developed, as the Republicans developed in the mid-1960s, a capacity to have very sophisticated politics, which they did, and the capacity for militant direct action, which they did, you're looking at quite a beast, in the best sense of the word, perhaps. I'm going to read some very brief extracts from what Costello wrote and was saying, but I think they're quite important. Now, in 1965, he spoke at a commemoration in Arco, which is represented in this room. Arco, as many will know, was the scene of the second most decisive battle of 1798, on the 9th of June 1798, a very important battle. And Costello knew all about that. And in reading his overall speech, it's quite clear that he's done his homework. And it's more than just a quick reading of P.F. Cavanagh's The Insurrection of Wexford. I now, of course, lost the bit I was going to read. But basically, I have to read almost any part of it. There's quite a lot to digest. I'll read this bit. Sinn Féin has planned a campaign of political action throughout the whole country, which will take the form of a militant programme of agitation to prevent the further takeover of the land, industry and trade of the country by foreign speculators, and to ensure that the resources of the nation are placed firmly in the hands of the people of the nation. Sinn Féin has also planned a national programme of political action to force the withdrawal of British troops and British administrative forces from the six-county area. And that is all left-leaning Republicans know is the only way these things can happen, the only way these things are likely to happen, which is that the issue of Connolly and Pearse must be resolved, and the balance between political assertion and armed action has to be fixed if it's going to be impactful, if it's going to actually work. Now, what you see here, in my opinion, is a very modern, progressive point. It does go back to Lawlerism, it does go back to Connolly. Of course it was. It's in that tradition. It is in the tradition of the men of no property. And it's interesting to note that the best-selling author of the biography of Wolfe Tone, Marion Elliott, OBE, has vehemently denied that Tone was talking about the land of the Swedes when he spoke of the men of no property. Well, a former member of the Fisher Republican movement from Belfast, Jim Smith, now a lecturer in history in Notre Dame, Indiana, deliberately called his book on the defenders of the Dublin City United Irishmen, the men of no property, to reassert that he did. And of course he did. So we're looking here at someone who's definitely deeply engaged, is basically a street activist for the totality of his life. Now, by the mid-1960s, of course, he was a very senior figure, formally in the party and in the army, we've heard from Sean Doyle. And to rise to become Adjutant General and Director of Operations and to have senior positions through the Sinn Féin annex as well is important. At Bodenstown, which, as many will realise, important policy strategic speeches tend to be given, not necessarily written by those who deliver them, but the speech that he gave in Bodenstown in 1966 raised an eyebrow. Now, this is the same year, of course, that he was primarily responsible for a riot by insisting that the blue flag of Oban Mahara and Dublin Brigade was going to Glasnevin one way or another. So there was a lot of stuff going on. This is the year that the IRA itself was slightly embarrassed to have their moment of thunder eclipsed by former comrade Joe Crystal, who did the demolition job in Nelson's Pillar. And the attempt to have, I suppose, a spectacular by a barracks raid in Newry did not come off for reasons that I won't detain us with today, but suffice to say the security on the ground wasn't what it needed to be. So when Costello spoke, This is how it was reported. At 4:47 p.m., Seamus Costello, one hand in his pocket and one holding a sheet of papers, began his address. He spoke of the 6 counties, dependent on a regime backed by the British forces. This regime has perpetuated bigotry. And the 26 counties, the most that could be said is that religious discrimination is absent. Okay? He spoke of the sorry mess that has been made of the Irish economy and said the Irish people are not told that the profits of their labour is invested abroad by native and foreign capitalists. Well, that's how the Irish Times reported it. Here's another thing that was said in that speech. He actually cites Laura, he cites Mitchell, Pearse and Connolly. He moves on to talk about that continuum of 98, 48, 67, 1916, just locating those seismic events in the theories and practices of those left-of-centre thinkers. Therefore, to imagine that we can establish a republic solely by constitutional means is utter folly. The lesson of history shows that in the final analysis, the Robert Baron must be disestablished by the same methods that he used to enrich himself and retain his ill-gotten gains, namely force of arms. To this end, we must organise, train, and maintain a disciplined armed force which will always be available to strike at the opportune moment. That's what he actually said. Right? A very muted version is given in the press account. Because they will lie to us. They always lie to us. And they will particularly lie when they're hearing a message like that from as gifted and as penetrating an orator as Seamus Costello. I've got my own sheet of papers here getting confused. I don't need to delay us all day. I'm sure people are anxious to hear the questions for the rest of the panel. But just to move forward, I think you can see there, because I believe he meant every word of that. I believe that's the authentic voice of Seamus Costello and his inner plea. That he was someone who was never going to countenance the drift in downgrading the status of the IRA within the Republican movement. Now, while he was saying this, the IRA was being reduced in size by the Chief of Staff Capital Building. There were 1.1, but only up to 100 volunteers trained. Only up to 100 volunteers trained. There was only one significant unit in Dublin. And the element of it that was secret, that had been training and operating under conditions of good unit security, was deliberately unmasked by being required to form a colour party unmasked. And of course they were photographed and were immediately had their names taken. And they included, amongst other people, Jim Monaghan, who's had a long career in such things. Now, it's not just that the army was being downgraded. The attempts to modernise weaponry were more or less abandoned. The attempts to centralise weaponry continued. And ironically, in terms of what's going to happen later on, people like McStephon were directly involved in that, as was Paddy Ryan, another people would have assumed a very militant Republican, which he was, about a traditional orientated Republican, which he was. But people like Ryan and McStephon were involved in gathering the weapons so that they would not be in the hands of the brigades and the local units. It was quite extraordinary. So there's reasons why there's a lack of preparation in 1969. There's reason why the exposure of the lack of preparedness in the Belfast Gate sector, specifically in August 1969, had such significant ramifications. Because those who were commanding the Republican movement from Dublin, often in opposition and with hostile attitudes towards the Belfast Brigade staff, knew that there were weapons, just they weren't going to be given them. Many of these areas had better stocks of weapons in 1959, 60, 61, 62 than they were allowed to maintain, even for training purposes, in 68, 69. And very often when you hear about these small quantity weapons being turning up, they are the training weapons. They're not actually the arsenals which had been under command of the local QMs. It's complicated. We don't know the truth about this. I haven't ever seen a single satisfactory account of it, and I've heard many authoritative but conflicting reports of what was going on. I can't get to the bottom of it, and nor did those who formed the Provisional IRA in Belfast, and nor even did those who retained command of what became the official IRA in Belfast. They were very disenchanted with the attitude of the headquarters in Dublin. So I can imagine that Costello must have found this deeply frustrating, immensely frustrating, because he would realise that the opportunities to press an issue in a state of dangerous flux were being lost, and that even such thing as basic area defence was not possible in terms of the manner in which the IRA was structured in the north. Little wonder that they were concerned that Newry, which in those days was not the town it is these days, that Newry was a place where serious problems could happen, as well as Derry, as well as Belfast, and indeed other border settlements as well. So, when the civil rights strategy, to which he's alluding there by the political programme, when the civil rights strategy was derailed by loyalist fascism, backed by the sectarian D-specials, RUC, and underpinned by the British military, when that was going on, the IRA was exposed because in its attempt to engage a long-term politicization strategy, which is perfectly logical and perfectly progressive, they neglected the armed struggle to the point that they're incapable of even basic activity. Now, they were capable of tactical intervention, and you have the subordination of the IRA to Sinn Féin and the overall leadership. And you see it in the Dublin Housing Action Committee, you see the McDire cooperative investment, you see it specifically in the Shannon strikebreakers, in the silver mines dispute. You see the IRA baring its teeth every now and again. And that is really the purpose that Goulding and those around him wished it to have. Not sufficient to force the issue of the border. Not sufficient in the moment of crisis, even as a contingency to seriously undermine Stormont, let alone pressurise the British directly in London. There'll be some years where any vestiges of a serious campaign were mounted in London. The belly of the beast, if you like. Now, we know for a fact that these tensions led to a number of splits. It also led to other forms of cohesion. And the Republican movement as it evolved in different sections, even the provisional aspect of it, the dominant one, and ultimately the most militant aspect of it until later, the provisional element itself was factionalized, but had nonetheless generally managed to hold within it a broad view of ultra-left, left, right, and in some cases probably quite right-of-centre elements at the same time. Like your volunteer from parts of rural Fermanagh is not the same man as the volunteer from the Short Strand or Doyne, let alone Andersonstown or Ballymurphy. And they're not the same type of volunteer you're going to find in Tralee, but they're all bound into one command structure. And the official movement was like that as well, with one difference. The level of internal discipline and party discipline that seems to be enforced within the official movement was ferocious, absolutely ferocious. And it leads to a zero-sum game of you're with us or you're out. And when you're out, you are really out. So when in December 1974, on the Feast of Immaculate Conception, I hope that was coincidence, Sean, on the Feast of Immaculate Conception, the IRSP was founded in Dublin, and an element that became known subsequently as the Irish National Liberation Army was simultaneously founded. They knew that a Rubicon had been crossed. I understand that Seamus Costello was still somewhat disconcerted by the level of violence inflicted on the new members in Belfast. And indeed, Hugh Ferguson and others were killed. So it was a very bitter reaction. But that is consistent with the attitude of the official public movement towards those who regard as defectors. And, most importantly, rivals. Political rivals. And I suppose one of the biggest questions of all, when we do come to look at these things from a position of cool heads and good information, one of the biggest questions that must be asked, and will always remain, I suppose, untenable, is what would have happened if the Republican movement had not split, if the IRA had not split in December 1969, and that would have forestalled the necessity of a further split in December 1974, and indeed others. There were minor leakages and losses of areas and personalities as well. Well, if the late 1970s were anything to go by, it would have been possible to simultaneously mount an absolutely ferocious level of offensive in many countries against the common enemy, and have a sophisticated, well-resourced and efficient political adjunct. In other words, what people like Costello wanted and were advocating in the mid-1960s would have been possible. Now, unfortunately, what infamy will get is absolutely nowhere. But I think it's worth reflecting on that, because this is what we have lost. This is what was lost and squandered by bad decisions taken under pressure, certainly, but decisions have destroyed this country and enabled us now to appeal from a position of weakness to the goodwill of our neighbours in London, in Brussels, and elsewhere. Now, Costello, as you know, was heavily involved in directing the military affairs of the official IRA as it became known. His name has arisen in relation to some of the more ambitious and difficult activities, such as, for instance, the attempt to land arms, acquire substantial stocks of arms for Huddersfield in 1969, the issue of which Amos Mullen and Jerry Doherty were jailed in England, the Aldershot attack in February 1972, when as you know, the headquarters of the Parachute Brigade was heavily attacked by a powerful car bomb. Didn't go according to plan, of course. And then you have the mistake, Goulding's greatest mistake, of the premature ceasefire in May 72. Now, it wasn't a real ceasefire. It was neither here nor there. It answered no immediate policy whatsoever. There wasn't even a deal on their prisoners. They didn't even negotiate on behalf of their prisoners. That is a case study of how not to go about a peace process. You do not call a unilateral ceasefire. in that manner. It's unbelievable. And it would lead someone to believe, you could be forgiven for thinking that Goulding must have been turned. There was something so strange and perverse about a unilateral ceasefire then that it beguiles belief. And by December 74, the internal contradictions of the organised element of the official Republican movement, which had to do with provisionals, but was coming out the second best, were such that Costello had to break away and bring with him a small core of those he retained confidence in. There was a baptism of fire, as you've heard. For the moment, there was ferocious attacks on the party. Now, we can understand why, but this is the nature of the element. April 1976, you have the Stalinist debacle, and something that should be rated one of the biggest political scandals in modern Irish history, when quite deliberately, the most righteous aspects of the special branch were targeted on people they knew could have no hand or part in robbing a train in Sales. They knew it. And you don't go arresting the editor of the Starry Cloud newspaper expecting him to be the fellow with a balaclava and a short in the train. It's so obvious, but we won't be able to say this authoritatively, because we will never ever get to see what the real papers on this are. We will never ever be revealed to us unless there's some sort of, whistleblower. We probably won't ever see how these things were actually decided. And in the meanwhile, we'll be stonewalled, and there'll be no entry for Seamus Costello in any biographical dictionary. So in conclusion, I'll just say this. There's no doubt in my mind, and I think I could probably risk speaking for all of us here, or most of us here, that Seamus Costello was a significant and important Irishman. He was, in many respects, an extremely gifted political operator. He was ahead of his time. Many of his methodologies, I think, retain a relevance. And in reading some of those speeches about the role of foreign intervention, of expropriation, of basically speaking, the degradation of this country in the face of external threat, and indeed internal threat by virtue of partition, there is a scary, uncanny resonance. And I do know this. The authorities today are sleeping on sound in their beds, knowing, sadly, that Seamus Costello is in a premature grave. Because they fear people like that, and they fear that type of politics. Thanks very much.